Hello, I'm Lexi, and this is what you should know. So, I have some exciting personal news that I really just wanted to share with you all. I recently got engaged! My partner and I have been together for nearly 3 years, and I'm just so happy. It was such a fun and different way of asking, too. He got a cameo, so one of my favorite celebrities asked for him. So there were tears, laughter, and a teeny tiny panic attack. So good times. But while I'm sure you're all happy for me, you're not here for that. I just had to share because it isn't every day that your ghoul gets engaged. But what you are here for, in the year 1892, when the West was rough, young Paul Nichols had seen his mother, father, and two sisters shot down by ruthless cattle rustlers. It was that day onward he pledged himself against crime, and at the age of 20 started his career as the Lone Avenger, a name feared by crooks. If you're taking a second to cotton onto that, between 1947 and 1953, The Lone Avenger was one of the most popular comic books in Australia during a time when shipping comic books from the United States was not possible. This comic book was created by Leonard Lawson, a man who would then go on to spend most of his life in prison. So this is what you should know about the comic book killer, Len Lawson. Keith and Eileen were both just 18 when they married and had a son they named Leonard Keith Lawson in 1927. Growing up in Wagga Wagga, Len's father, Keith, was a local celebrity because he was a talented boxer known as the Wagga Walloper. Len showed a lot of promise as he was an extremely gifted student, topping all of his classes. But his real talent really was in art. Len was a natural and showed a rare talent for drawing that was noticed by his peers very early. It was the 1940s that the Lawson family moved to Manly, and it was there, at the tender age of 15, Len gained his first commercial success as a comic book artist when he won a national competition run by artist and publisher Sid Miller, a man famous for co-creating the iconic Chesty Bonds character. The comic book Len created told a war story set in the Pacific and was included in an anthology published by Sid. On the back of his success, Len started studying art in Sydney, and by February of 1945, he had published a full-length adventure comic called Peter Jury, which was included in Sid Miller's monster comic publication, whose tagline was, "For Australian Boys." Len had really started to gain notoriety, with the Wagga Wagga Daily Advertiser boasting, "Len is only 17 years of age and has promise of becoming one of Australia's leading comic artists." Len was both considered mature, both personally and professionally, and just like his own parents, he married at the age of 18 with his wife Betty Jamieson, who was also 18, in September of 1946. It was October that same year that Len got the biggest career break when he wrote and illustrated all the stories in the very first issue of Action Comics, published by H.J. Edwards Proprietary Limited. First came the science fiction tale of Spencer Steele, who was exploring the universe in the far-off future of 1956. Then came the thrills of speed racer Johnny Starr and the adventures of Detective Michael Justice. So just a bit of background, the Australian comic market consisted mostly of American imports prior to the 1940s. However, at the start of World War II, the Australian government banned the import of American comics, and Australia was able to develop its own local comic industry. At the conclusion of the war, Australia found itself with a large national debt and a determination to support local businesses. As a result, the Australian government kept the import restrictions in place. This gave Australian comic publishers the advantage of no competition and a captive audience of comic book readers. With popular characters like Flash Gordon, the Lone Ranger, and Tarzan in their respective comics unavailable here in Australia, there were huge opportunities to be taken advantage of in the local market. So by the second issue of Action Comics, Len's most famous character finally debuted, the Lone Avenger. This comic told the story of a masked cowboy named Paul Nichols, who dressed in a white hat, red mask, green shirt, and leather gauntlets, belt, and boots. The Lone Avenger fought crime, first on the range as a wandering hero, then in the town of Red Rock, where he eventually would settle down and become marshal of the town. Bull Malone, his sidekick, would become his deputy. This was an obvious ripoff of Fran Stryker's Lone Ranger. While Action Comics had been an anthology, the Lone Avenger soon took over the entire book and would continue his crime-fighting run for 13 years, with kids all over Australia, New Zealand, and Fiji joining the fan club, buying Lone Avenger toys and outfits. Other characters Len published for Action Comics included another cowboy, this one called the Hooded Rider, and a wild jungle babe known as Diana, Queen of the Apes. However, the Lone Avenger had the biggest following, selling over 70,000 copies per issue. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, good for Len, but how is this really true crime related, aside from basic plagiarism? And that is a very fair question. He definitely never got into any trouble with his blatant ripoffs and made a lot of money for himself while creating comics. It sounds like a real success story, as in the early 50s, Len had a successful career, a happy marriage that had produced 3 children, and was earning £70 a week, which is the equivalent of $2,400 per week now. He really seemed to have it all, but in this true crime podcast, you know that isn't where the story ends. There was something very dark and twisted inside Leonard Lawson, something that he was not able to keep contained. It all came apart for Len on May the 7th, 1954, when he hired 5 Sydney models. 2 were aged 15, and the others were 18, 21, and 23. Len had told them he wanted them for a calendar that he intended to publish. He picked them up from the studio at 9:30 a.m., stopped in St. Leonard's to buy some sandwiches for the day's supposed picnic vibe. He then drove them to Terry Hills, and they walked from the car through the thick scrub. One of the girls complained, saying, "Of all the beautiful places in Sydney, I don't know why you had to pick this place to take photographs." Len had snapped back at her, saying that he was paying her for this day's work, and that she was going to do as she was told. This beautiful and sunny day soon took a dark turn when Len's moves shifted, as he told the girls, "When this calendar comes out, I won't be here. I have cancer." The models were understandably horrified and saddened by the news and tried to show their genuine sympathy. Len told them he was planning to commit suicide rather than enduring an agonizing death, and took a sawn-off rifle from his backpack, loaded it, and declared that he was going to kill himself then and there. Scared and crying, the girls begged with him not to. It was then that Len abruptly turned the rifle on them, telling them all to lay on their stomachs. He was going to tie them up. He said so they couldn't stop him from shooting himself. He tied their hands and wrists, using sticking plaster to cover their mouths. It was then that his true purpose became clear, as he began removing or cutting off their clothes. He told them they'd each get a bullet in their head if they resisted. He then continued on to rape 2 girls, and tried to rape a third, and indecently assaulted and intimidated the other 2. Almost as if he came back to some level of sanity and reality, he told them that he didn't know why he picked these decent girls instead of street women, as if choosing a sex worker would make it any less indecent. He untied his victims and paid them each their £6 fee and drove them to Gordon, because one of the girls wanted to go to the chemist to buy cigarettes. It was as if he thought what had happened was no big deal, so he didn't bother to follow her in or ensure she wasn't notifying anyone. Once inside the pharmacy, the girl called her parents and then the police, who promptly came to the pharmacy and arrested Len while he was still sitting in his car outside. In the days to come, Len would give 7 confessions. However, when the case against him on the rape charges were heard on the 24th of May, he pleaded not guilty. The models testified against him at length, going into and providing chilling detail of how he'd manipulated them before showing his true colors. Len's lawyer claimed that these allegations were not true, and that the girls had been willing participants in a shoot that was meant to be burlesque in the theme of rape. When testifying, Len said he'd had sex with some of his accusers, but it had been consensual. He then stated that he did feel guilty, but only because he had betrayed his wedding vows. Thankfully, the jury didn't need to deliberate for long. as they hadn't bought into his lies, and Len was found guilty on 2 charges of rape and on further charges of sexual assault. Justice Clancy passed the death sentence, adding he saw no reason why it should not be carried out, even if Len would be the first man executed for rape in New South Wales for 57 years. 17 men had hanged for rape, described as a criminal assault, since 1788, and the last man executed for the offence was Charles Hines on the 21st of May, 1898. Len's wife Betty divorced him and moved to Queensland for a fresh start, not wanting her family to be brought up around a monster like him. And with that, he rarely saw his young family ever again. The youngest was only a baby at the time and never had anything to do with their father. Len was incarcerated at Long Bay Jail as he waited the cabinet's decision on whether to commute his death sentence. It was very doubtful that he would receive the death sentence, as social activists were lobbying the governments of the time as the punishment's relevance to these modern times. It was at this time that a question came to the front. Was Len sane? A government-appointed psychiatrist found that he was in fact sane, but even so, his death sentence was commuted, but not to life, but 14 years imprisonment. During the trial and his time in prison, the fact Len made comic books was highlighted, and one newspaper even described him as the artist of violent comics which frequently depicted bosomy heroines. While in prison, the court also denied his request to be allowed to continue to draw the Lone Avenger while in prison to support his family. Betty was fine with this, as she quite sharply told him from Queensland that she was working and did not want nor need his help. Len was considered a model prisoner at Goulburn Jail, and like many other evil people before him, he found religion, painted religious images, and taught younger prisoners to read, write, and draw. It was his exemplary conduct that led him to being released on parole after just serving half of his sentence. In August of 1954, during a wave of censorship, The Lone Avenger was one of the first books to be banned. In an attempt to appease the other Australian states and to continue publishing books, Gordon and Gotch sanitized The Lone Avenger. However, despite these efforts, The Lone Avenger soon rode off into the sunset, a victim of his own creator's crime. On the 24th of May, 1961, Len was again a free man, and it would only take 6 months for Leonard Lawson to do an unspeakable act and end up in jail again. However, this time, it would be for life. He rented an apartment on the northern beaches and bought a car with money given to him by his mother. Trying to gain some stability, Len had numerous sexual liaisons with women he met casually and prostitutes, but they couldn't satisfy the dark and violent fantasies that occupied his mind. Now he was no longer in prison, he found it was getting harder to ignore. Len roamed south to Moss Vale, where on the 20th of June he went to the Church of England Grammar School and introduced himself to the headmistress, Jean Turnbull. He told her that he was an author writing a novel based on a girls' school, and inquired about the possibility of observing the girls to ensure he would get the right ideas and feelings down. She invited him to lunch in the dining room and gave him a tour of the school. Len visited the school again once or twice, attending chapel and again lunching with the students. Late in September of 1961, Len met and befriended a 16-year-old girl named Jane Bauer. He charmed the teenager and her family, telling them he wanted to paint Jane's portrait and convinced them to allow it. Jane posed for him several times. On Monday, the 6th of November, Len picked Jane up at the city art shop where she worked. They then collected her mother and he drove them back to the Bauer house in Manly, where they had an early dinner together. The family trusted Len and allowed him to take Jane to his apartment so he could sketch her. There, out of sight from her parents, he made advances on her, but she rebuffed him. This angered him, but he was prepared. Before he had brought Jane back to his apartment, he'd filled a sock with sand and readied pre-cut lengths of rope. With Jane sitting on the couch, Len went to the bedroom and got the sock and swung it hard into her head, knocking her out. Len tied her wrists together and took off her clothes, and then proceeded to rape her. As Jane was waking up, Len started to strangle her. When she struggled, he grabbed a hunting knife and plunged it into her chest, hitting her heart. Using an eyebrow pencil, he wrote on her torso, "God forgive me, Len." At this point, I'm honestly unsure if he felt genuine guilt for killing Jane or if he wanted to taunt anyone he could. Jane's parents became anxious when she didn't return home and asked her cousin to help search. During the search, they visited Len's flat, but no one answered. After a whole night of searching, they came back to Len's flat just before 8 a.m. the following morning. It was there that Jane's cousin broke in and found her dead body. Shortly before 9 a.m., at the Sydney Police Headquarters, plans were being drawn up for a statewide search. However, that was not necessary, as within minutes, the whereabouts of Len were known. The previous night, Len had fled the murder scene in his car and drove south to Moss Vale, arriving around 2:30 a.m. and parked on the side of the road, where he sat and wrote a letter to his parents. "Dear Mum and Dad, I've done a shocking and dreadful thing. Whatever this monster that moves in my body is, it did it with vengeance this time." After that pitiful excuse, he said he was sorry and that he was going to kill himself. Unfortunately, that isn't what he ended up doing because this man is human trash. It was at 8:30 a.m. that he drove to the Church of England grammar school that he had scoped out months earlier. With him, he had a .22 Remington rifle, 167 rounds of ammunition, the knife he'd used to kill Jane, and pre-cut lengths of rope. This was all premeditated, even if he tried to claim that he had a monster living in him. It was just after 9 a.m. 150 students were in the school chapel under the supervision of the headmistress Jean Turnbull. It was a shock for many when suddenly Leonard Lawson, the author they had met months earlier, was in the doorway of the chapel, armed with a gun. He demanded that everyone be quiet and not to move, and yelled out, "If anyone tries anything silly, one of the girls will be shot." The headmistress demanded to know what he wanted, and he replied by saying, "I'm going to hold these girls hostages here until 12 o'clock. I've killed someone already, and I want to speak with 3 people." Len allowed Miss Turnbull to return to the front of the chapel and continue the service. In an attempt to distract themselves from their terrors, the girls sang hymns loudly. While this was happening, Len gave a piece of paper to another staff member, Miss Brooks, who left the chapel with it. In it listed out demands stating that it needed to be read carefully before any attempts were made to contact the police because lives depended on it. He told the police to obey his instructions and that if anyone came within 100 feet of the chapel, he'd shoot a girl, saying, "I'm not bluffing. I've killed once, so now I have everything to gain and nothing to lose by killing more. It's the same penalty I must face." Amongst his instructions were to gain 3 people for him to talk to: a nun who'd visited him in prison, reigning Miss Australia, Tanya Verstack, and Olympic athlete Marlene Matthews. While Len wasn't paying attention, headmistress Miss Turnbull wrote her own note and threw it out the window. "A man is holding us up in here with a shotgun. Get lots of police. He is threatening to shoot the girls." With Len getting more and more aggressive, the teachers and students were sure he was about to start shooting. Jean Turnbull was a badass, as she demanded to know that if Len was going to shoot, why not shoot her or one of the other staff? And why not just leave the girls alone? She was backed up by the French teacher, Madame Sherman, and she said that they had lived most of their lives, and that the kids still had lives to live. When the police arrived, they approached the chapel, and Len saw them through the window. He then stated to them that he saw the police and advised that he was going to start shooting. It was at this that this complete badass, Miss Turnbull, jumped into action, grabbing the gun, keeping it aimed away from the students, some of who also rushed at Len. These ladies were not having it. Not today. And it was then that Len started firing, and 5 shots rang out. Seeing the scuffle through the chapel door, a detective and a constable tried to get inside. However, Len had secured the door with a cord. A constable smashed the glass panel near them, and with that distraction, Miss Turnbull managed to thrust the rifle barrel through the frame. The constable grabbed the gun and pulled it free. Now he and a detective burst in and subdued the still struggling Len. The headmistress had painful powder burns on both of her hands and a hole in her dress where a bullet had passed through the fabric, but otherwise she was completely unharmed. Unfortunately, 15-year-old Wendy Luscombe, a very popular red-headed student, lay on the floor, hit in the chest by a stray bullet. She died in the arms of a friend. Leonard Lawson was taken to the Mossvale police station and interrogated by police, where he said he'd never meant to harm anyone, despite the absolutely overwhelming evidence pointing to the contrary, and claimed to have been temporarily insane. Len faced court again in December of 1961, charged with the murder of Jane Bower, where he pled not guilty. If the case against him failed, he'd then be tried for the death of Wendy Luscombe. During the court proceedings, the only defense witness was a psychiatrist that testified that Len was sane when he killed Jane Bower. Len spoke directly to the court saying, "I can't explain what made me do this terrible thing, because I don't know." And then, in traditional fashion for him, professed that he was sorry. Like, what a loser. Hiding behind such a weak excuse of, "I don't know why I did it." Like a small child that got caught doing something that they shouldn't. He's not an 8-year-old that managed to knock a vase off of a table. He's a grown-ass man that killed a child. On April the 4th, 1962, it took the jury 17 minutes to find him guilty of Jane Bower's murder. With a life sentence a certainty, Leonard Lawson wasn't tried for the death of Wendy Luscombe. In good news, in 1962, headmistress Jean Turnbull was awarded an MBE for her bravery. The police who'd wrestled him also received commendations. Back behind bars, Leonard Lawson again became a model prisoner, but he wasn't finished yet. On Sunday, June the 18th, 1972, a concert was held in the chapel of Parramatta Jail to entertain the prisoners. Once the concert was over, the entertainers, including 3 dancers, were invited to have some light refreshments put on by the Arts and Crafts Committee, which Len was the secretary of. The prisoners and performers mingled in a rec room, decorated with portrait paintings created by Len. Sharon Hamilton, a 23-year-old dancer, was admiring a portrait of his when Len gained her attention and asked her to sign the visitor's book. As she did, she complimented his art. When it was announced that the event was over, Len was asked to give a speech. In an instant, he grabbed Sharon and put a knife to her throat and another to her back. He demanded that everyone leave the room, threatening to kill her. However, Len wasn't dealing with frightened schoolgirls or models that he had lured to the bush. This time, he was in a room full of criminals, none of which wanted to see her get hurt. 2 of the other prisoners lunged at Len, one of which punched him in the face. A prison guard stepped in, grappled with him, while the other prisoner pulled Sharon Hamilton free to safety. Len dropped one knife, and the other was ripped away from him by a second guard who helped contain him. Sharon was left bleeding, with small cuts on her neck, hand, and back. Len faced court for this in August of 1972 and was sentenced to a further 5 years. While there would have been some relief for Sharon, she served a sentence in her own psychological prison, finding it hard to work, to go out, or to socialize. Everywhere she looked, she feared that she would see Len. Understandably, from the ordeal she went through, she was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, which was still a few years away from being defined and recognized as a disorder. From 1974 to 1976, Sharon was treated at Chelmsford, where destructive, deep sleep and electroshock therapy was practiced, leading to the deaths of 43 patients and eventual royal commission. In 1976, Sharon was awarded a payout from the state government of nearly $100,000, admitting their negligence regarding Len's attack on her. Unfortunately, her life didn't get any easier, and in 1978, she sadly took her own life. While serving his sentence, Len continued to paint, donating his artworks to charity, raising tens of thousands of dollars, which is a stark contrast to the damage that had landed him in prison in the first place. In 1994, the possibility of parole was raised, But Wendy Luscombe's brother, along with several women who'd survived the school siege, protested loudly, and the government listened, and Len remained in Grafton jail. In 1999, now the longest-serving Australian prisoner, Len was interviewed for 60 minutes where he presented himself as a kindly old man who wanted the chance to feel the grass under his feet and draw pure, free breath one more time before he died. However, no one was prepared to be fooled by him again, and on the 29th of November 2003, Leonard Keith Lawson died, alone, aged at 76, and was missed by no one. And on that note, that's all I have for you this week. As always, I will be posting pictures regarding the case on Facebook and Instagram. What You Should Know Australia. I do have a call out for Australian hauntings and ghost stories, so please, please, please send them to me. I want them. I need them. I really can't take myself seriously. But you can send me anything to my email, whatyoushouldknowaustralia@gmail.com. Until next week, stay safe and stay hydrated. Bye!